Auspicious greetings, venerables, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you to everyone online for taking the time to be here with us today. I'm Jie Wei, Director of the Humanistic Buddhism Center at the Nantian Institute in Australia. There's much that I wish to say, but time is precious and I should leave as much time as possible for the insights which we look forward to hearing from our upcoming speakers. So, let me begin with the beautiful tradition of Australia by acknowledging the Dharawal people as the traditional owners of the land on which NTI resides. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all are. And I pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Indigenous peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters on which we now have the privilege to enjoy. It is my honor now to invite the President of the Nantian Institute of Higher Education, Professor Denise Kirkpatrick, to deliver the official welcome address. Professor Kirkpatrick, please.
So, thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to welcome participants today from all around the globe. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're meeting, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm joining you from the land of the Darug people. I'm really pleased to welcome you to today's seminar, which will have an interactive component to it. As you know, and I know many of you are either alumni or very close friends of the Nantian Institute or of the Centre for Humanistic Buddhism, which is hosted by Nantian Institute. I know many of you meet regularly as part of the communities of practice for the Sunday check-in sessions. So welcome to all of you. It was absolutely wonderful to see so many of you connecting to acquaintances, friends and colleagues before this actually went live. I think it's particularly timely that we hear from our two young speakers this morning. Social media has become such a big part of everybody's lives. And we all know that it's both demonized and lauded for the contribution that it can make to individual lives and to society more generally. I was going back through a presentation that I gave almost 20 years ago, in which I was talking about the new and emerging social media and the role and the impact of them on lives, on business, and in particular on young people. I recall that at that time, we talked about being always connected and always on. And that is more true now than ever before. We've all read, we all participate, we are all users of social media, some of us more so than others. We've read, I think, quite a lot about the development of social media. We've read many pieces written about concerns about the impact of social media, again, on individuals and collectively. But I think it's also important that when we think about social media and its impact on lives, we also remember that the intentions of the developers of many of the technologies that we use today were benign, and often they were very positive and very optimistic. So when the developers of Facebook implemented likes, they did it for all the right reasons, but they did not think about the unintended consequences and the other effects of the impact of the use of likes by users, and particularly by young users. When we look at other social media, we look at things like Instagram, the use of filters, the representations often very, very unrealistic of the lives of the people who are known as influencers and who post prolifically. the behind the scenes intervention of big business and advertisers and marketers, and the impact that some of these quite unrealistic representations of life, of possessions, and of relationships have a very serious and often unintended consequence, particularly so for the young and for the vulnerable. But we also have to not only demonize social media. We have all seen, particularly over the last year or so, the absolutely positive effect of social media, the connections, the cohesion, the capacity and the ability to create new social groups and to support each other remotely, to run events similar to this, but to run events that are very important in people's lives and to keep that connection going in a very simple and easy way. So as I said, I think this is a really timely session for us to be attending. And I think it's also extremely appropriate that what we're going to do today is hear the results and research findings of research conducted by young people. We're talking about the effects on young people, and I think it's absolutely critical that it is the young people who are being engaged and are performing the research and sharing their interpretations and their findings with us today. So once again, I'd really like to thank the Humanistic Buddhism Centre for organising today's seminar. Venerable Jay Wei, thank you so much. I'm going to encourage you all to engage with our speakers and with each other in the interactive sessions. And thank you once again for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kirkpatrick, for this insightful and beautiful opening. The organizing committee of the Communities of Practice feels truly privileged that you can join us today. Just a few words about the Communities of Practice for those of you who may not know us. We started in late 2018 as a physical gathering of like-minded community members interested in creating and developing a reflective practice to examine humanistic Buddhist responses to modern crisis. Last year, like most others, we went online, and now the Communities of Practice has gone international with weekly meetings as a result of platforms such as this, which Professor Kirkpatrick has just alluded to. After a successful poetic reflection on 2020 workshop in January, today's event on disruptive technology is another timely intervention from the community for the community. Our speakers are two thoughtful and youthful members of the Communities of Practice. Alex Trout-Goy is a PhD candidate at the University of Wollongong. His research focuses on cross-cultural perceptions and justifications for digital technologies and ways in which big data is being used to govern populations. He has previously worked for a media intelligence company. With him is Jade Hutchinson, a PhD candidate at Macquarie University and Netherlands Groningen University. He has formerly worked as a research analyst at Singapore's Nanyang Technological University. Just a few words in terms of logistics. This session is being recorded so that insights generated can be shared more widely. We ask that you remain muted until the breakouts about 50 minutes later. You are welcome to put your comments and questions in the chat during the presentation. It is now my pleasure to welcome Alex and Jade to deliver their research findings on how social media is reshaping identity, communities, and relationships, that is, affecting us and people dear to us. Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Venerable Jue. And for all of those present today that have gathered from around the world, it seems like we have a really, an international presence here, which is really great to see. And thanks also to the Nantian Institute for their support, not only today, but over the past 3 years. This has been the culmination of a long 3-year process of research between Jade and I, and also community outreach and engagement. And the Nantian Institute and the amazing team behind this workshop has been there every step of the way. So we sincerely thank them for that. There are 3 things that I want to make really, really clear before getting started today, and that I want everyone to bear in mind as we're going to be presenting. The first is that this is a really, really complex issue. And the pair of us have tried our best to condense this down into a 90-minute workshop that is accessible to different generational groups. But in the process of doing so, we've been naturally forced to prioritize some elements of the story over others. And so we encourage the audience, please, you're going to get the most out of this if you seek clarification, post questions in the group chat, participate in the polls that we raise and the group discussions that we're going to be having. And for those of you watching at a later date, to do the same. Think about what we're going to be discussing impacts you in your everyday life. Second, we want to stress that this isn't a presentation against technology. This isn't even a presentation against social media. What this is a presentation of an analysis and a critique of how social media has come to operate today. Because the social media we're using today is not the social media from 15 years ago, from 10 years ago, 5 years ago, or even 1 year ago. This is a rapidly changing technology. And the problem is that many of these changes have been deliberately pursued outside of public awareness. This is also not a critique coming from 2 people who do not themselves use social media. Jade and I use a variety of different social media platforms. And to be honest, one of the things that has been most confronting and emotionally difficult for me personally has been the recognition and the realization that the pair of us are not somehow immune from some of the addictive behaviors that we're going to be discussing today. This is a shared experience. And even the people responsible for designing these systems that have worked for these companies in Silicon Valley have themselves admitted to falling prey to some of the very strategies and techniques these companies employ to get us glued to our screens for as long as possible. So we know that social media accelerates innovation in industry. We know that it keeps people connected during a pandemic. It drives cost savings and strengthens mass collaboration. It connects people, often people who have never met in real life and may never get the chance to meet. And we should not lose sight of these things. We should celebrate these things. We should champion these things. But we have to recognize that there are complicated and incredibly harmful trends that undercut our growing reliance on social media and the ease with which we can access it and it can access us wherever we are and whatever we may be doing. Over the past 3 years, it has been the mission of both Jade and I to examine and engage the community in a discussion over these trends. And it is for this reason that we sit here before you today, perhaps more alarmed now than we have been before. So to begin, what do we actually mean by social media? Here is a common definition that we typically see. And from this definition, there are 3 key points that we can glean. The first is that social media connects a person's online profile with those of other individuals or groups, and therefore facilitates the development of human social networks. User-generated content, such as posts or comments, photos or videos, and data, which is generated through our online interactions, comprise most of the information we see on social media. And third, this user-generated content is directed and curated by social media companies in question, such as your Facebook, your Twitter, your YouTube, etc., who are responsible for designing and maintaining these platforms. So to think about where we actually are in this point of time when it comes to the evolution of social media, I turn to Digital 2021, which is a global overview report of internet and social media trends, which is published by We Are Social and Hootsuite every year. And so this report, Digital 2021, came out very recently in January. And what it revealed is during 2020, the year of COVID, that the total number of active social media users around the world was 4.2 billion, which is around 53.6% of the global population. Now, it's important to understand that active social media users does not equal one individual person having these accounts, because we know that people can have a variety or be active across a variety of different accounts. At the same time, there was massive growth in the number of social media users in 2020 with a 13.2% increase. This is a really important point as well, where we've seen a shift from people accessing social media using a computer to social media becoming mobile. People are accessing around 98% of the total number of active social media users are accessing social media via their mobile phones. The average amount of times per day spent using social media was 2 hours and 25 minutes. And another really important point is that we're not just using social media to connect with friends and family and stay in touch anymore, but it now is actually a requirement in many professional work jobs and roles to have a sense of social media acumen, right? To be social media technology savvy, with 40.4% of people admitting that they need to use social media for work purposes. We turn to the world's most used social media platforms. The really key thing that I want to draw your attention to here is that the top 5 social media platforms are actually owned and managed by 2 companies, the 2 elephants in the room that we can't really ignore, because we know that Facebook owns WhatsApp, it owns Facebook Messenger, it owns Instagram, and that Google owns YouTube. And this is really important because these 2 companies have essentially set the name of the game. They have established certain parameters around which social media has evolved. And so it's very important that we understand how and why they have designed these technologies in the way that they have. And we can see here daily time spent using social media. There's 2 discrepancies. One is between different age groups, with 16 to 24 and 25 to 34-year-olds using social media on average more than the older age groups, but also that across age groups, it's women that are using social media more than men. But really critically, in the 16 to 24 age group, this discrepancy is most acute, with on average, young women aged 16 to 24 using social media on average 3 hours and 14 minutes per day, which Jade is going to be discussing has significant mental health consequences. So this is the first discussion that we'll be posing to everyone. And you can answer and respond to these questions as I keep presenting. Priscilla is going to make sure that these questions are available in the group chat for you to refer back to. The first question I want to ask is, what social media platform do you use the most? Is it one from among the list or perhaps an outlier? And the second question is, why do you use it? We're all using social media for a variety of different reasons. Perhaps some reasons are more conscious and thought out than others. So why do you feel like you use it? What are the primary reasons? Please post your comments in the group chat and I will continue with the presentation. So we turn now to the components of social media. And I like to think about the components of social media in terms of what we see and what we don't see. An analogy you can use is your phone, right? Where your phone, you have the shiny external exterior. And on the inside, we have the components that dictate how the phone actually works, that actually dictate what you see on your phone and on your screen. In much the same way, what we see when it comes to social media is what we see when we log on. And what we don't see is the underlying program, right? The underlying values and assumptions that the companies responsible for designing and maintaining these technologies have that dictate what we actually see on the surface. So we begin with what we see. And of course, we see individual people, we see users and profiles of people, we see other users, and we see groups of users. And Mark Zuckerberg, in 2005, a year after he established Facebook, famously referred to social media and Facebook as a social utility or an online directory. The idea was that you had a profile and you could view other people's profiles, but there was no such thing as a news feed yet, no such thing as some kind of a public notice board, which is updated in real time and to which we respond to. And so in 2009, we saw a really big transformation. It might not seem that big, but what happened was Facebook creates the like button, Twitter copies it, Twitter creates the retweet button, Facebook copies that, and ad infinitum until we've got all of these social media companies that are competing in this space figuring out how we can apply quantified numbers to determine social esteem, to determine what's popular, what's relevant, what's worth paying attention to, what is worth paying attention to versus what is not worth paying attention to. And really, really importantly, now social media companies have enormous amounts of information about what people click on and what engages them. So what is new here is that you create content, other people rate you on that content. And so you're tuned in, constantly surveying, sensitive to what posts get liked, what posts get rated poorly. And this is all underpinned by a schedule of reinforcements that are based on the same logic as slot machines at casinos. So we know that slot machines at casinos, through the use of bright colors, pleasing sounds, and notifications, trigger the release of the neurotransmitter dopamine, which is known as the feel-good chemical in the brain and contributes to feelings of pleasure and satisfaction. And as we will see, the objective here is to maximize engagement. Social media is no longer just about keeping people connected, but actually about changing behavior at scale. So we also see the news feed. This is user-generated content. It's really important to iterate that the vast majority of what we actually see on social media, we as individual people are creating ourselves. The content that we produce is produced by ourselves. And the social media companies essentially sets up the overarching framework where this information is presented. So this information typically appears in a feed, and it's specific to the individual. So there's actually been studies that have been done where, say, for example, I get given your smartphone, you get given mine, and we log into each other's social media feeds. And it was found that there is nowhere near the same level of engagement, that people quickly lose interest if social media is not personalized to their existing beliefs, to their interests, and to their social networks. And this translates over into severe consequences when it comes to misinformation and also the production of echo chambers. And we also see, obviously, the platform, which is where the action takes place, as I mentioned, responsible for the overarching design and determines what can and can't be shared and how. So we turn now to what we don't see. And to really understand how and why social media platforms are designed the way that they are, we have to go back to the late 1990s, early 2000s, when the internet was first taking off. So at the time, there was a lot of speculation around which internet companies would make it big, and wanting to cash in on the next biggest craze, people were investing really heavily into these early Silicon Valley companies. The problem was that few of these startups were producing any real revenue at this point. They weren't creating any really value, leading to a massive overevaluation of stock prices and an eventual crash. So what would later become known as the dot-com crash resulted in many early internet companies going bankrupt and shutting down. And following this crash, and faced with the prospect of closure, the executive board at Google realized that the company could transform data exhaust, or behavioral data, which is derived through personal internet use, into something which could be sold. So you can think of this data as records that are created whenever we do something online. And such data includes, for example, keywords, the number and pattern of search terms, how a query is phrased, spelling, punctuation, how long we stay on certain pages for, log-on habits, click patterns, personal information about our devices, and our location. Initially, Google used this information to enhance their services and provide a better experience for users, but they realized that with enough data, they could predict our real-life behavior and sell these predictions to advertisers who want to sell us something. This is the core of their business model. And learning from Google, first Facebook and now other social media companies competing in this space have adopted and evolved this model. The more people who use a particular social media platform like Facebook, the more information the company amasses, resulting in better predictions and higher advertising revenues. But it doesn't actually matter if you don't have a Facebook account or rarely use services created by Google, because both companies can still create a data profile of you based on your general internet activity. And we know this because a 2015 analysis of the top 1 million websites in the world found that 90% leaked data to other domains that track, capture, and expropriate user data for commercial purposes. So among these top 1 million most popular websites in the world, 78% initiate data transfers to a domain owned by one company, Google, and another 34% transfer to a Facebook-owned domain. In other words, two sole companies have access to and use personal data collected from nearly every square corner of the internet. And this is how such companies have become some of the wealthiest and most successful in the world. But don't just take my word for it. To give you a feel for the unimaginable amount of information these social media companies have collected and continue to collect from us, let's hear from ex-social media company employees. And the following is a brief clip taken from the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. So this begs the question, what is actually being done with all of this data? Our digital profiles, the information that these companies collect about us, are classified in line with categories that they determine. And this is called social sorting. Social sorting happens when the company or organization gathering data separate up individuals into groups so they can be treated in a particular way. These groups can be based on income, education, gender, social status, political affiliation, consumption habit, personality type, or even emotional state. These classifications are often incomplete because they ignore or disregard everything else that exists outside of the neatly defined categories that platform owners establish to determine how we should be treated. And a recent study showed that a variety of personal attributes can be determined by analyzing a user's Facebook likes alone. Cambridge University and Microsoft researchers have shown how someone's pattern of Facebook likes can very accurately predict their sexual orientation, satisfaction with life, intelligence, emotional stability, alcohol and drug use, relationship status, age, gender, race, and political views, among many others. If you would be reluctant to share all this information with your closest friend or family member, why are we so trusting of a global corporation with no democratic oversight and which is intent on growth at any cost? So let's think of an example of social sorting. You frequently buy clothing online. Data about your purchase records, search history, and dwell times on clothing websites is all recorded. This information puts you into a category of high-class consumer that you never see or know about. The company then sells this information to advertisers who target you with intensified clothing ads through its platforms. This encourages you to consume more and may even fuel an online shopping addiction. Your underlying long-term interests or health and well-being is not important. What is important is that the data collected about you reveals that you are a high-class consumer, and thus you are treated in a particular way to maximize profits. So we turn to the second discussion here. And I'm really curious to know, what kind of ads do you see on social media? And can you recall ever seeing an ad or information on social media that was eerily relevant to your private life? How did that make you feel, or how did you respond to that? So we turn now to the final thing that we don't see. We don't see the machine algorithm. A machine algorithm is something that solves problems and makes decisions on behalf of humans. To simply put it, you can think of it like a robot that receives a set of instructions from human programmers and then figures out how to best accomplish these instructions by analyzing masses of data. Social media algorithms connect users with content they believe they want to see the most. However, the primary intention behind this design is to get people to spend more time on the platform and engage with more content. Facebook's primary goal is to keep you on the platform and to get you to click ads, and its newsfeed algorithm ultimately exists to support these efforts. In sorting through and learning from the mountains of data accessible to these social media companies, algorithms influence what we think by determining what we see in our social media feeds, how we think about it by framing issues in ways that align with our own beliefs and interests, and when we see certain content. The important thing to understand is that no one, not even the engineers at these companies, know how these algorithms make the decisions that they do. We only know that the underlying goal written into the programming is to keep eyes on screens for as long as possible. A consequence is that these self-teaching algorithms have learned on their own that anger keeps users on site longer, Because it drives more interaction, and that drives advertising. Digital forensics expert Professor Henry Farid told a recent US House committee, and I quote, "Mark Zuckerberg is hiding the fact that he knows that hate, lies, and divisiveness are good for business. They didn't set out to fuel misinformation, hate, and divisiveness, but that's what the algorithms learned." Facebook's data science group has actually run more than 1,000 experiments on users since it was created in 2007. In 2014, and as part of a published experiment, Facebook admitted to experimenting on nearly 700,000 users by altering the amount of positive or negative information these people were receiving in their news feeds. Not only did this experiment demonstrate that emotions could be passed between users on a mass scale through social media, it more importantly highlighted how easily the company could do this without concern for ethics. A leaked internal report produced by Facebook executives in 2017 revealed the company had real-time insight into the emotional states of nearly 6 million young Australians. The company alleged it could tell when young people were feeling stressed, defeated, anxious, stupid, silly, useless, or a failure through analysis of internal Facebook data. Based on these mood shifts, the company could allegedly tailor advertisements and content to ensure these young users stayed online for as long as possible. Over time, and with enough data input, social media companies gradually mastered the schedule of reinforcements and notifications in the form of rewards, recognition, or praise that can reliably produce the specific behavior they need, ever increasing engagement with the platform, the consequence of which has been exponential growth in social media addiction and mental health crises. A company like Facebook can make people feel happier or sadder intentionally without their awareness. These techniques can be used to get you to vote for a politician you wouldn't have otherwise voted for, in the same way they can persuade you to purchase something that you don't really need. At the heart of our relationship with social media lies manipulation. It may be subtle, it may be outside the realm of conscious awareness. We may feel it to be harmless, but that doesn't mean it is right. Shedding our deepest secrets in exchange for being able to talk with our friends and family is not a fair trade. Lighting the path to profit with the flames of anger and outrage harms our shared humanity. The good news is that we have the tools to change all of this for the better. It begins with those responsible for the design of these technologies genuinely listening to and incorporating the ideas and concerns of the people actually using social media, all of us. Facebook previously conducted a study where they surveyed users on what content they thought was good for the world or bad for the world. And they discovered that you could alter the algorithm to show more content that people believe is good for the world, which immediately translated over into having positive impacts on disinformation, online outrage, and polarization. But realizing it didn't produce the same levels of engagement with the platform, they didn't implement the findings. What was once championed as a social utility has now become the site of mass addiction and manipulation, largely due to the attention economy's bottom line of engagement. I'll now pass the baton to Jade to describe the impact this has on our collective mental health.
Thank you very much. So now that Alex has introduced us to some of the history and operating concepts that underlie the structure of social media, I'm going to narrow down on some of the ways this technology can influence how we think, feel, and behave. Social media companies use many concepts and processes when designing their instruments of influence, and all of them are complex. My aim here today is to simply convey a basic understanding of some of the ways we are receptive to this influence and illustrate some of the negative effects that social media has on our minds and lives. It might be best to start by describing an evolutionary disposition born of our species' origins that we've all come to bear and we continue to carry with us into the present day. Our species is a particular type of evolved primate who survived and thrived for millions of years, in part because we developed advanced faculties that are very sensitive to social information and also subtle changes in social connection. These faculties allowed us to maximize meaningful relationships and cooperate with our fellow creatures at scale. Our relationships continue to define who we are, how we think and behave, and determine whether or not we survive. Like our ancestors, and like this last year of forced isolation can attest, our social life remains a fundamental part of our well-being and prosperity as a species. However, our need for connection, our need for approval, to which we so depend, is also highly manipulative or highly susceptible to manipulation. For the promise of connection, for acceptance and belonging, we are willing to damage, degrade, and turn drone-like our minds and bodies. This brings us to what is called the Skinner box. The Skinner box is based on the idea that all behavior is learned through interaction with the environment, and animals like ourselves can be conditioned to behave in specific ways if the environment deters or reinforces that behavior, even if the behavior is extremely complex. As long as you can control how the animal learns from the environment by, say, applying the appropriate ratio and timing of rewards or deterrence, you can incrementally change that animal's behavior over time. Social media companies employ Skinner box-like techniques, and they do this to modify the behavior of their consumers, you and I. Like a human Skinner box, social media platforms and their interface are designed to reduce your attention and behavior down to a very small number of options. And these options afford specific actions and experiences, and they are strategically accompanied by certain rewards to reinforce engagement. Over time, the technology learns what cues and what content best triggers you to return to the platform and again reinforce your engagement. On the deterrent side, they're designed to discourage self-reflection and disengagement through this appropriate timing of rewards. And this is what leaves you scrolling in anticipation for the next one, for the next bump. These companies lure us in so effectively because they understand that there is a certain set of dimensions to your experience, and all of them can be manipulated. They understand that we need social connection, we crave approval, and we are willing to sacrifice our time, attention, and even our health in order to attain it. They understand that in order to be human is to be persuadable. But that's not it. They also understand that each reward and deterrent awashes our brain with signals that reinforce our engagement with the technology. Every time you pick up and scroll the newsfeed, tiny signals of information drawn from your experience, they skate along these network tracks throughout various areas of the brain. The more these signals skate along those tracks, the more important those signals and tracks become, and the more likely we are to behave in the same way over and over again. Think of how a sled creates tracks in the snow, like in the image you can see on the slide. And these tracks become more ingrained the more that they are used. And over time, the sled easily passes through them. Similarly to what happens in the brain, this process tightly calibrates the brain with certain behaviors and in certain environments. And the more this association is made, the more streamlined the whole system becomes, and the less and less we have to think about when or how to behave. No need to rely on new information. Your brain simply self-organizes the information, predicts what's going to happen in the future, and then attempts to go through the motions. And in a lot of ways, this is really, really useful. Remember what it was like to learn to use your first mobile phone. I bet it was exciting and maybe even slightly clunky at first, but as time went on, you learned to rapidly navigate the interface until it became unconscious, even automatic. Now, can you remember each and every time you have used your phone over the last week? Even after the last day? It's hard to put a number to it, isn't it? This is because your brain knows what to do and doesn't have to think much or pay such close attention to how or when to use it anymore in the same way. The issue is that these processes that are happening in you and I right now are entirely invisible to us. They're unable to be inspected and are also highly vulnerable to manipulation. While you're sat staring at your phone, these processes are at work in the background. They're sending information, cementing these networks, constructing emotion, gradually ingraining new ways of thinking and behaving, and slowly moving you towards a position where you won't be consciously aware of how many times you picked up the phone or for how long you've scrolled it. Think how effortless and unconscious it is to grab your phone and start scrolling social media, say while waiting for a coffee or a train. I invite you instead, please look around the cafe, look around the train station and reflect on what you see. Though these changes in behavior may seem small, I'm just looking at my phone, what's the big deal? Remember, when these techniques and these processes are carefully and consistently applied, they have a reliable compounding effect. And over time, these subtle changes can transform our relationship with our phone, with ourselves, and with one another. So I am very interested to find out, how much time do you think you spend on social media? Please be as honest as you can. Please submit your answers into the poll. It should be appearing in front of you, while I will wait for a brief moment while these results filter in. All right, so we've got another 10 seconds to submit your answers into the poll. There's very interesting findings that are coming up thus far. I can see about 22% of us may be lying. No, I'm just kidding. I'm sure some of you spend less than an hour per day, but this poll should give you pause to reevaluate your relationship with your mobile phone. Click on the, yeah. Okay. So social media companies market their technology as passive and nothing but a social good, as Alex mentioned. But remember, core to these companies' economic models and often common among their mission statements is their ambition to competitively secure as much data as possible, as many users as possible, so we all stay engaged for as long as possible. They know we are keenly aware of our social environment and that our brain is a self-organizing system that is constantly learning to anticipate and reinforce ways of thinking that are in tune with our environment. Not only have these companies worked hard and smart to become an ever-growing part of our environment, but the technology itself is also a self-organizing system designed to constantly monitor and record changes in your brain and body so as to anticipate and also reinforce ways of thinking and behaving in you. Rather than being entirely separate, non-cooperative systems, your brain and social media should be thought as integral parts of a single system, evolving in real time in response to one another. But this is not a mutual coexistence. Right? Social media is not designed with your well-being in mind. We come off second best in this manipulative relationship because unlike the tech, we are an entirely biological beings with an evolutionary disposition ill-equipped to defend our own psychology from the micromanagement, marketing, and manipulation that these companies and their technology exert. And they know this. And yet they do not disclose information about their intended influence. So this forces scholars to try to de-engineer the impact after the fact. This means that we don't entirely know the true extent of the impact of social media, but research is now discovering the wide range of distress and dangerous effects that extensive mobile phone use and engagement with social media can exert. With young adults, teens, and children often bearing the greatest harm. This is why, for the second poll, I'm wondering, how old were you when you started to use a smartphone or when you downloaded a social media application for the first time? Again, can you please submit your answers into the poll, and I'll wait for a moment while they pour in. Interesting. So we seem to have a lead with people who are 36 years or older. Very good. So it seems that the particular age demographic that we might have in our audience arrived at social media, or say at smartphone use, beyond the time of of their teens, which is good. I really appreciate that there's a wide range of ages here. So now onto the consequences. Research has discovered that even having your smartphone consistently present on the table during work or a social interaction notably disrupts patterns in attention. It radically reduces your working and long-term memory. It limits your ability to solve problems. It detracts from the engagement, and it can even stunt the way that your brain develops. Multiple studies have recorded the shockingly high frequency of smartphone use, with participants checking their phone on average 110 to 221 times per day, over 1,500 times per week, and in peak periods every 6 to 7 seconds. What is worse is that the frequency in which we check our phones means that we struggle to remember how many times we actually check it. It is a behavior so common to our brains that we no longer need to consciously think or remember it in the same way. We are increasingly using social media for connectivity, but it is insufficient as a surrogate for meaningful social connection. In 2019, a study discovered that children in the UK under the age of 14 spend nearly twice as long on devices as they do in conversation with their families. These children spend on average 23 hours per week isolated to their phones, to tablets or game consoles at home, which was almost double the amount of time they spent conversing with their parents. In 2020, following the onset of COVID-19, this is the graph represented on the right-hand side of the slide, a study found that the percentage proportion of children and teenagers who spent more than 4 hours a day on devices nearly doubled across every age demographic. This includes 0 to 4-year-olds, 0 to 4. But it's not just yesterday's children who are susceptible, but today's parents. Excessive use of social media has been shown to affect the strong bond between a parent and a child. Parents are more distracted and less attuned with their children if they're constantly focusing on their devices, meaning that they're physically present but emotionally distant from their children. This distance and disconnection only creates a gap, or not only creates a gap between the parent and the child, but it also affects the psychological well-being and brain development of the child. It can cement the foundations for mental and behavioral disorders like attachment issues, obesity, developmental delays, addiction, learning disabilities, and atypical gaze, which can continue to affect the child for the remainder of their life. I've personally spoken to multiple doctors who are concerned with the increasing number of single mothers who are addicted to their mobile phones, so much so that their infants show evidence of delays in development, such as the inability to orientate their gaze with their mothers because she's looking at the mobile phone, or unable to register emotional and social cues because their mother is not giving the infant ample opportunities for face-to-face interaction. As we become dependent on these devices to make us feel in certain ways, this reliance can lead to an inability to properly manage our social relations with our smartphone use. A survey of over 2,000 American adults found that not only was there a high incidence of Facebook addiction, but a third of 18 to 44-year-olds felt noticeably anxious if they had not checked Facebook in the last 2 hours. Participants in this study were so addicted that 31% self-reported using Facebook while driving and 16% while making love with someone else. This is not exclusive to social media either. Other studies have found that 40% responded to work emails during family dinners, 10% at their child's school event, and 6% while their spouse was giving labor, and another 6% while at a loved one's funeral. Social media preemptively appeals to our sensitivity for connection, acceptance, and also desirability. The social signals we receive while using the technology acts like a feedback growth hormone. It inflates the amount of social feedback that we get from others while using it. If the feedback is consistently negative or unrealistic, this can turn the technology into an insidious steroid that inflates and degrades our self-esteem and self-image. This is why studies are discovering that people with low self-esteem tend to take or post selfies more than others with higher self-esteem. So this is so they boost their own self-confidence. In the 3 years after selfie filters were launched on the platform Snapchat, the number of plastic surgeons hired to conduct cosmetic surgery on clients specifically to look more attractive on social media quadrupled. 13 to 55%. The greatest increase in these patients were under the age of 30, with a large percentage of them being teenagers, 13 to 19 years old. Medical professionals in this study self-reported that their clients were victims to social media's ability to distort the sense of self and body image, leading to a significant increase in body dysmorphic disorders. Social media also registers when you are sensitive to certain types of content. It narrows this topic of content to pique your attention, right? To keep you engaged, and strategically finds the best times to introduce topics that will continue to re-pique your attention over time. Instagram has been found to repeatedly prioritize distorted images of food and how people react to food, so that users will pay attention to these posts, particularly those who are sensitive to these topics. And studies are now stating that the longer that users spend on Instagram, the more likely they are to develop a self-image related disorder like orthorexia nervosa, a severe eating disorder. Now, self-reported studies are criticized, right, for being subjectively biased by, say, changes in diagnostic criteria or for the fallibility of participant memory, among other things. But when you have hospital admissions and deaths, this is more of an objective measure. These are young adults, teenagers, and even children who are brought into the hospital because they've cut themselves deliberately or committed suicide successfully. Granted, trends in the rates of self-harm and suicide are complicated and often change in response to worldly events. One of those is when social media was introduced to mobile phones in 2019. From 2019 to 2018, as you can see on the slide there was a 70% increase in suicides among American females aged 15 to 19, and a 151% increase among females just 10 to 14. Not exclusive to the US or to girls, however, suicide for boys and girls in these age demographics show a similar trend in places like Canada, Britain, New Zealand, South Pacific, and even here in Australia. Statistical data gathered by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare showed that Australian females aged 15 to 19 also show a 69 to 70% increase in suicide during a similar time frame. Okay, so what about suicide? In the United States, 2019 to 2015, there was a 62% increase in hospitalizations, females aged 15 to 19, and a whopping 189% increase in females aged just 10 to 14, nearly 200%. Okay, so what about Australia? 2009 to 2019, there was a 48% increase in hospitalizations for self-harm, females 15 to 19, and peaking in 2017 with 82% increase. And please do not be deceived by the gradient of the line at the lower half of the graph, because females 14 and younger, there was a 126% increase, with a similar peak in 2017 with 158%. I was in conversation with a local clinical psychologist just this week who voiced their concern for the growing number of clients who are committing self-harm, to which they told me, quote, all of them speak of their negative relationship with social media, all of them. While rates of self-harm seem to decline in this graph from 2018 to 2020, there is an overwhelming and an overall upward trend that matches that of countries like the United States, as I've shown, and the research conducted by Jonathan Haidt and other colleagues. Although the straightforward correlations are there, I understand that this does not prove causality. Social media disrupts an already complex and difficult to understand causal chain of influence. And yes, as Professor Kirkpatrick mentioned at the top of this presentation, social media has contributed a vast amount of good. It is a tool for expression, for communication and culture. It promotes and exercises the enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms, and it can even assist with the distribution of important information. But we must not only focus on the good, because it may result in a stubborn refusal to acknowledge its downfalls. While there isn't a consensus on all the ways or perhaps the full extent in which social media affects us, this should not be thought of as controversial. It is the most disruptive personal technology we have yet encountered as a species, and we must acknowledge its intimacy in our lives. Think of where your smartphone is right now, right? And look how much time you spend on it, because it is seeking to know the deepest, most vulnerable parts and processes of you, the parts that not even you can inspect, and manipulate them to determine how you will think and behave in the future. Even whilst I was writing this presentation, I struggled with my use of social media, compulsively doing the rounds between Facebook, Twitter, and emails. But it's not just you, right? It is your family and friends too. Think about someone in your life who is becoming distracted by their phone, dependent on social media, and disengaged from their life. Knowing what you know about the nature and effect of this tech now, if you were them, wouldn't you want someone to help you? I hope you find an answer to this question, because it doesn't matter where you go. You will find yourself confronted with this situation, either addicted or aware and able to help others.
Yes, some sobering insights. And so we turn to some much needed good news. And there is a lot of inspiring efforts that are being directed towards this problem and reimagining our relationship with social media. In 2019, the Australia Institute, which is one of the country's most influential public policy think tanks, established the Centre for Responsible Technology. The centre advocates for the design and deployment of social media technologies that are appropriate, responsible, and adhere to the core Australian values of fairness, egalitarianism, and a commitment to democracy. The centre has supported a recent Australian Competition and Consumer Commission inquiry, which has advocated for individuals to be granted more control over their data through data portability. And data portability is simply the ability for the public to take their data from one platform to another, which lessens the possibility they are trapped on one platform where they've created so much data, so much content. There are also calls for data separation, which would make sure companies like Google and Facebook are unable to share large amounts of personal user data between products, such as YouTube data being shared with the main Google infrastructure. Elsewhere in the world, candidate for mayor of New York City, Andrew Yang, has promoted the Data Dividend Project, a new program tasked with establishing data as property rights under US privacy laws. The program hopes to mobilize over 1 million people by the end of the year and pave the way for a future in which all Americans can claim their data as property right and receive payment if they choose to share their data with platforms.
Thank you. Also, in the United States, the Center for Humane Technology, it's an independent, not-for-profit organization founded by an ex-Google design ethicist named Tristan Harris. And they are dedicated to radically reimagining our digital infrastructure, including social media. Their mission is to drive a comprehensive shift towards humane technology that supports our well-being, democracy, and a shared information environment. The center advocates against the advertisement model and engagement models as the bottom line of social media, as we've talked about. In 2016, the Taiwanese government created a new role under the title Digital Minister. And Taiwan has created an amazing open source software which builds consensus on controversial topics and drives legislative change through an open consultation process that allows the entire society to engage in rational discussion on national issues. The platform is based on a mixture of online agenda setting by citizens and government deliberations that are fully transparent and live streamed. It is a revitalizing way that citizens in Taiwan can engage with their government and how the government engages with their citizens. There are also local community events that we must highlight here that bring together different generations to discuss these issues publicly. And these are essential to moving the conversation forward also. And I applaud Nhan Tien for leading by example in our community. I do hand back to the vulnerable so we can all begin these breakout rooms. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex and Jade, for this insightful and thought-provoking presentation. Let's take some time to digest the content in smaller breakout groups. In your groups, take a few minutes to introduce yourselves, and then let's focus on our reflections. What have you heard that resonates with you, positively or negatively? So what about it is important to you? And now, what do you plan to do about it? That is, the 3 questions of what, so what, and now what. Let's share our personal experiences and strategies to engage with social media in a healthier and more meaningful way. We will see you back here in 10 minutes. Disruptive technology is such a big and pertinent topic that I'm sure we have more to discuss than we have time for. Dr. Priscilla Wong, the coordinator for this Communities of Practice series, has been working hard behind the scenes while you were discussing to compile your questions from the chat. So I'd like to pose my first question to Alex and Jade. But while we answer that question, I invite everyone to continue to put any more questions and comments that you may have into the group chat. So the first question for you, well, Jade. The first question from Craig Lewis. As they say, thoughts become things. What is social media contributing to evolution?
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that question. This is a question that a lot of evolutionary biologists are thinking about right now. What is the rate of evolutionary change in the face of some of the present day conditions, particularly our dependence and relationship on technology? And this is difficult, right? It's always difficult to predict what is going to happen, particularly with some things such as complex and as elegant as natural selection. But we can look back to the past. So for instance, if you were to think of something that you felt was marginal, right, an adaptation that you thought was insignificant, say eyebrows, right? We all have eyebrows now, and you think, well, what would possibly be the use of this, right? It seems quite subtle in the scheme of survival. But then you think of, say, a reason like eyebrows are there to prevent sweat from falling into your eye and stinging you at the exact moment where you need your eyes to survive, right? So you're huddled somewhere next to a bush and the bush begins to rustle in a rather concerning manner. And you think to yourself, I might stop eating that mango I just found and maybe concentrate on it. And in that moment where you need to duck, you need to get away, the eyebrows save you from that sweat getting in your eye. So there are mathematical models put to this about how to measure the spread of an insignificant trait like this. So you say if you had one person in 1,000 who had eyebrows and 999 people who also survived but did not have eyebrows. And so then they tried to find how many generations would it actually take for eyebrows to then begin to spread throughout that population. And it turns out that on a geological scale, it happens in an instant. It's instantaneous, right? There is such a few number of generations that it takes for something like insignificant as eyebrows to spread to something like, I forget the numbers now, but it's like 50% of the population studied, right? And we find that in nature, the selection pressures are much, much stronger than that. They're much stronger than 1 in 1,000, right? Much like the example I gave with eyebrows. So in answer to your question, I do fear about the influence that things like social media are having over our process of evolution, because I think the selection pressure is very, very strong, right? Not only in the immediate sense, but also in how it is, how it filters through culture as well to our biology, and then also intergenerationally, right? Of course, which is the main preoccupation with evolution, is that if ecology thinks through space, evolution thinks through time, right? Through the influence that it has on generations. And I fear, I hope it does not happen, but I fear that even within a few or one generation, or a handful of generations, neurologists will begin to see changes in the structure of the brain due to a significant increase in the use of social media. Our body will respond to it in some manner or other. Unfortunately, I don't have the ability to predict it on evolutionary timescales. But thank you so much for that question.
Thank you so much, Jade. The second question has just come in. It says, in many cases, we are aware that our data is being used for manipulation, but we tend to have an apathetic concern over this because the issue is too big. Is broader education on the detrimental effects the answer to this big problem? He's interested in your thoughts. Perhaps Alex, would you like to take that question?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I would definitely say education and awareness is where this begins. And also the realization that, data it's really important to recognize that data is really, really useful and has come to run society in a lot of different ways, and that we wouldn't be able to function as society today without it. So, it's really important for governments and for companies to actually know about us so that they can use this information to benefit us. For example, it's impossible for a government agency to know us each individually as Alex and Jade. It's impossible that they'll ever get to know us on that personal face-to-face basis. And therefore, data comes to represent us and stand in our place. But it's important that we know why it's being used for the purpose that why it is being used, who is using them, and what are the underlying values and assumptions that are dictating how our data is used at any one point in time. And there was a really great comment that was raised in one of the groups that I was talking to during these breakout sessions. We've got some great Buddhist college students, and one of them said, "Irem Wejul," and that essentially means to have people serve as the foundation, to have people be the guiding value. What are the needs of people? What are the needs of the people that this data is being used for? That is where this really needs to begin. And that necessarily forces us to question, the underlying business assumptions that have motivated the evolution of these processes, because obviously we've come to see that it is not tenable for our long-term health and our long-term sanity.
Thank you so much, Alex, for your answer. We have another question here from Chris. If we take smoking as an example, public education campaigns need to be consistent and well-funded to change bad habits in a population. Alex and Jade, in addition to reforms to regulate media company use of data, do you think a public media campaign is necessary to start rebalancing social media use?
Please.
Yeah, I would 100% be in favor of something like this. The issue with legislative responses to these issues, like we saw in 2018, the General Data Protection Regulation Act, which has been perhaps one of the most comprehensive regulations released by the European Union in Europe to combat some of these problems that we're talking about. But this is a really slow process. It's a reactive process. It's not a proactive process. A proactive process would be informing people so that they have the awareness and the understanding about how these systems are working to, distract them and to, monopolize as much of their attention as possible. So I would definitely be in favor of this kind of response. And the issue is that in the media, we rarely see these kinds of honest and frank discussions. And it might be partly because our politicians are quite outdated, speaking honestly about the issues that we're confronting. And it only happens that when we see traditional media, Murdoch Press being threatened by Google, right, and by Facebook, that we see the government start to stand up to these things. I would like to see the government start to stand up for the common people and for our young people. And so a public education campaign, I think, is a very necessary part of this.
Thank you. Jade, do you have a final comments?
Yes, I do. Just to focus on perhaps a more personal level of the potential for an education campaign, like Alex, I would agree and support a public awareness campaign that is directed towards educating an entire generation on the use and effects of social media. I think it would be really useful to try to reframe this issue in the minds of those who came in contact with that campaign. And this is in part what Alex and I are trying to do today. But I think it would have to be more than just a single campaign, right? It needs a systematic change in education, as well as a supportive cultural change in coming to grips with and approaching holistically social media.
Thank you both. There are more questions than we have time today. I'm very aware we have only 3 more minutes. So it's now time for me to bring the session to a close. For those of you who have more burning questions, we can leave the Zoom session open for another few minutes afterwards. And we will have this program available on our website as well. So finally, it would be remiss of me to end without thanking the many hands involved in making today's workshop happen. Alex and Jade approached me last year about the concept. Taking the concept to reality are Dr. Priscilla Wong, Joe Leong, Joel Goh, Stacy Wong, Liam Carver, and many ambassadors in various community groups worldwide. Also of great assistance are the staff and volunteers of Nantian Institute, led by Professor Kirkpatrick. Thank you too to Chief Abbess, Venerable Manko, Venerable Miaoja, Venerable Zhishan, and Francis for your support. Most of all, thank you to all of you for being here with us today. If you would like to continue exploring humanistic values and develop a reflective practice, please join us for our weekly 30-minute check-in sessions every Sunday at 11 in the morning, Australian Eastern Standard Time. We will resume these sessions next week. You may also find out more about the courses of study in NTI by checking out our website at nantian.edu.au or attend our virtual open day on the 3rd of June to see how our unique courses are delivered both online and through intensive 5 weeks to help you explore values to cope with the challenges of modern life. We have lots planned for the second half of the year too, so do connect with us by following NTI's Facebook page or subscribing to the Communities of Practice mailing list. Social media can be put to good use too. For young adults aged 18 to 35 years old, an online international Buddhist youth camp will be organized by the Oceania BLIA Yard in the first weekend of July. Find out more at anzbyc.net. I'd like now to dedicate the merits of all that we have learned today to all sentient beings. May we develop resilience, wisdom, and compassion in the face of inevitable challenges ahead.